Okay, good afternoon, friends. Thank you very much for coming to our talk event today. My name is Andy Wang. I'm currently the convener of the Cultural Studies Research Cluster here at in the Institute of European American Studies, Academia Sinica. This is really a long name, so I'm not going to repeat it again. I'm very happy and grateful for the fact that we have Wendy Chen with us, and as well as Liu Wen from our neighboring institute, the Institute of Ethnology, also in Academia Sinica. Uh, are people hearing okay? Yeah, okay. Thank you. And okay, sure. Yes, that sounds a little bit echoing. Okay. Anyway, this event is one of our Cultural Studies Research Cluster's ongoing series of talks. This has been the third one of the semester and will be also the last one of the semester. I'm sure this is going to be a lot of excitement as we approach the start of this event. This talk is also kindly co-sponsored by the Interasia Cultural Studies Society, which is a Hong Kong-based research network that I myself is personally affiliated with, but also a lot of colleagues here are familiar with. So that's why we also have an online version of it. So friends who are on the internet on WebEx will invite you to join the conversation after after the talk. So if you could turn off your microphone and image, that'll be ideal. Keep silent during the presentations, but then we'll invite you to be part of a conversation afterwards. We are here today to first of all celebrate the new publication by Wendy, which is hot off the press, called Island X, Taiwanese Student Migrants, Campus Spies, and Cold War Activism, out of which Wendy is gonna do a really careful presentation both about the book, but also the larger question of activism and surveillance in the Cold War era and beyond, particularly with the Taiwanese Americans. And I noticed in the room that we have quite a few veterans of activists like Gao Yishi and Linda, who have been very important part of this history. So we're really excited and also honored to have your presence here with us. So let me just introduce our speakers for the event today. Wendy Chen is Professor of American Studies at Scripps College and core faculty in the Intercollegiate Department of Asian American Studies. She is trained as a geographer in many ways, and her research focuses on race and ethnicity, comparative racialization, critical geography, urban and suburban studies, and diaspora. Her book, The Chance Next Door to the DS, Remapping Race and Suburbia of California, published by University of Minnesota Press 2013, won the 2014 Book Award from the American Sociological Association section on Asia and Asian America. Her co-authored book, The People's Guide to Los Angeles, with Laura Pulido and Laura Baraclaw, published by University of California Press 2012, for which she was also the photographer, and it won the Association of American Geographers Global Book Award for public understanding of geography and nonfiction, and another award for nonfiction. Her current research project focuses on the political activism of Taiwanese student migrants to the United States and the racial plunder in everyday landscape. In short, she's as much a geographer and ethnic studies scholar, and she has worn the two hats equally well. After Wendy's presentation, Wen Liu, who is currently an assistant research fellow at Institute of Ethnology, Academia Sinica, will serve as a discussant. As many friends know, Wen is a supernova in Taiwanese American studies these days. Her work cuts across social psychology, queer theory, and Asian American studies, and focuses on global social movements and the critical theories about racial and queer subjectivities. Her latest work appears in various well-established journals, including American Quarterly, International Journal of Taiwan Studies, and Security Dialogue, among others. Her book, Filling Asian American Racial Flexibility Between Assimilation and Oppression, which won National Women's Studies Association's first book prize, is forthcoming from University of Illinois Press, 2024. So as you can see, we have two really brilliant speakers today. And without further ado, we'll have Wendy start her presentation So thank you very much, Wendy, and let's welcome her.
Thank you so much, Andy, for inviting me to be here and for that wonderful introduction. And Andy's important book, Trans-Pacific Articulations, was an invaluable resource and inspiration for my own research, and I'm very grateful for his generosity as a colleague and a friend. I've also learned so much from Dr. Leowen's work, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing her comments and to the discussion with the audience. So I'd like to begin by telling you a little bit about my own Taiwanese American history and how it led me to do the research for my new book, Island X, Taiwanese Student Migrants, Campus Spies, and Cold War History. That's the book. So I was born in 1977 in Madison, Wisconsin, starting at the beginning. And there's Madison right there in the Midwest, which is actually a really important place for Taiwanese American history. Like many Taiwanese of their generation, my parents, Zheng Detang and Lai Suqing, came to the US in the early 1970s as graduate students in the sciences. They landed at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and within a few years, my dad became blacklisted by the KMT for taking a leadership role in the Taiwanese Student Association there. His dream of returning to Taiwan to become a professor at his alma mater, Tsinghua University, was dashed. And so except for a brief visit by my mom back to Taiwan when my older brother was a baby, our family was not able to safely go back to Taiwan until many years later after martial law ended in 1987. After settling in San Diego, having resigned themselves to not being able to return to Taiwan, my parents threw themselves into human rights and Taiwan independence activism. Over the next decades, as they developed their careers and raised our family, they remained committed to Taiwanese politics, actively participating in the Formosan Association for Human Rights, San Diego's Taiwan Tongshanghui, and the Taiwanese American Foundation of San Diego, and helping to establish the Taiwanese American Community Center there. Talk more about this report form later. So both personally in my research, I've thought a lot about how it is fundamentally because of the particular Cold War relationship between Taiwan and the US that we became Taiwanese Americans. Because my parents had the opportunity to come to the US as students, because they dared to assert that they were Taiwanese, and because they were under surveillance and ultimately blacklisted by the KMT. This is a common story among many Taiwanese of my parents' generation, but beyond the Taiwanese American community, and even within Taiwanese American communities, I found that these stories remain little known. So my book tells the story of this generation in the context of US-Taiwan relations and global Cold War history. Part 1 situates Taiwan in relationship to the US and provides an overview of the educational and social networks and how they served as a structure for political activism. I also discuss some less well-known, more radical and leftist strands that emerged from Taiwanese political activism during the 1970s and 1980s. And some of the people in this room appear in that section. Part 2 looks at 3 specific cases of Taiwanese migrants, Wang Chih-Ming, Chen Yuxu, and Chen Wenceng, who met with KMT state violence, including arrest, imprisonment, and murder on the basis of alleged political activities while living in the US. In my talk today, I will focus primarily on the content from Chapter 1 to speak about the structure of student migration to the US and how the conditions for both activism and surveillance were created. So you can check out this bit.ly if you want. It's an interactive map of 71 different political publications created in the diaspora by Taiwanese migrants. That's at Yes. So you can take a look at this bit.ly link. There's a short description in both Chinese and English of each of these publications, and they're color-coded by different political orientations. And this was just an initial mapping of the collection at Zhengda of overseas political publications that I did early on in my research before I realized that with my limited language capabilities, I was not going to be able to get too deep into it, right? But this is just to show the volume and reach of how Taiwanese migrants in the US, in Japan, in Europe, and South America were expressing themselves, right, by creating this dozens and dozens of political publications across the whole political spectrum. So more than 1,000 student migrants, 100,000 student migrants came to the US from the 1960s to 1980s, mostly for graduate studies in science, technology, engineering, and medicine fields. Although they were coming from an authoritarian society that had been under martial law since 1949, many Taiwanese students quickly gained the courage to participate actively in the public sphere. Taiwanese students quickly started or soon joined Taiwanese student associations and created social and political networks across the US and reaching Canada, Japan, Europe, and South America. They created and circulated their own political publications within Taiwanese communities, but also boldly entered into mainstream spaces of dialogue. They organized mass protests and actions, and some even plotted revolution through both peaceful and violent means. At the same time, the KMT extended beyond Taiwan a pervasive network of authoritarian supervision and control, and the continuous oppression of arguably minor subjects became central to the identity and political consciousness formation of a generation. This is an earlier version. Sorry. Okay, so there was a slide, go back. There was a slide that's a map of dozens of incidents of reported spying across the US. So sorry that we don't have that. But this campus informant form can stand in place of that. So from 1964 to 1991, there were dozens of reported instances of KMT spying on Taiwanese students on 21 US campuses, often by paid informants, fellow students from Taiwan who were sarcastically referred to as professional students. These were covered extensively by campus and local newspapers and to some degree by national and international media. At the campus and local level, a KMT informant form reportedly turned over to UC Berkeley's Daily Californian by a former spy in 1976 was widely reprinted. So I think one of the achievements of my book is just to reprint this form so everybody can see it, right, and see the level. Oh, really? Okay. Yeah, so it was printed in a lot of campus newspapers and local newspapers, at that time, and circulated quite widely, but has since been kind of hidden again. So, but you can see the level of detail of the kind of reporting that was going on, and also how those Cold War binaries informed what the categories were at all. So these reports were part of a widespread ROC government surveillance infrastructure called the Caihong, or Rainbow Project, so named because Caihong is a homonym for picking or stamping out the red, who the regime constantly referred to as Gongfei, communist bandits. Being reported on could mean anything from intimidation, threats of injury or death, and the harassment of family in Taiwan to being blacklisted from returning. Many cases culminated in arrest and imprisonment on return to Taiwan, as was the case with University of Wisconsin PhD student Wang Chih-Ming in 1967, Chen Yuxi, an economics student at University of Hawaii's East-West Center in 1968, Rita Ye Daolei, a former PhD student in sociology at University of Minnesota, and Chen Zhenran, a UCLA PhD student in sociology in 1991. Other cases culminated in death, as was the fate in 1981 of Carnegie Mellon professor Chen Wen-sung. In 1984, the KMT went even farther, ordering the assassination of author Henry Liu Yilang, who had written an unfavorable biography of Zhang Jingguo in the driveway of his Daly City, California home. Historian Calvin Chong-Miao points to such moments as evidence of, quote, the growing convergence between domestic and foreign repression, end quote, during the early 1980s, as the Reagan administration seemed to make exceptions for trans-Pacific acts of domestic terrorism committed by authoritarian, i.e. anti-communist, versus totalitarian, i.e. communist regimes. A slippery Cold War definition explicitly calculated to support long-term US interests. As diplomat and political scientist Jean Kirkpatrick wrote in 1979 in Dictatorships and Double Standards, an essay that would shape foreign policy in the Reagan era, as did Kirkpatrick herself, since Reagan appointed her as his foreign policy advisor and the US ambassador to the United Nations. So Kirkpatrick wrote, should the US censure or act against friendly authoritarian governments, quote, at best, we will have lost access to friendly territory. At worst, the Soviets will have gained a new base. And everywhere our friends will have noted that the US cannot be counted on in times of difficulty, and our enemies will have observed that American support provides no security against the foreign march of history, end quote. So Taiwanese students in the US had very few protections, right, against being surveilled and terrorized. In the 1980s and 1990s, Lin-Chi Wang, an important figure in establishing Asian American studies during that time, argued that the Chen Wen-sung and Liu murders were part of a longer history and structure of what he called dual domination, under which Chinese and Taiwanese in the US were both violently surveilled by the nationalist government and made vulnerable by their racial subordination in the United States. During the 1960s, political scientist Douglas Mandel, who was then a professor at University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, estimated that up to 20% of Taiwanese migrants were politically active, and a majority of those involved in Taiwanese social organizations were sympathetic to Taiwan independence. Similarly, in a survey of Taiwanese students and professionals in 1970, Xu Yangzhang found that anti-Zhang pro-democracy sentiment was widespread, and almost 1/5 listed escape as a reason for leaving Taiwan. So how and why did they get politicized? Through my research and in-depth interviews with 30 Taiwanese who came to the US as student migrants, I found that their politicization in the US took shape through three interrelated conditions. First, an anti-colonial or subaltern mentality. Second, tightly connected institutional and social networks. And third, greater access to written materials and freedom of expression. And I'll talk about each of these. So the motivations of these activists would not have taken shape in the way that they did if they did not tap into an existing anti-colonial or subaltern mentality. In Taiwan's 400-year history, leftist Taiwan independence activist Chih-Ming argued that Taiwan Yishi, or Taiwanese consciousness, emerged from a long history of anti-authoritarianism in Taiwan. He described this mentality as, quote, the tradition of resisting foreign invasion. This began, he argued, with indigenous resistance to the Dutch in the 1600s and continued through the Ching dynasty and then into the subsequent periods of Japanese and KMT rule. These struggles and sentiments created a distinct people and culture over time. In Formosa Betrayed, American diplomat George Kerr, who witnessed the 228 incident, described Taiwan under Qing dynasty rule in similar terms. 2 centuries of ineffective and abusive rule generated a local Formosan tradition of resentment and underlying hostility toward representatives of mainland authority. One of my interviewees, Chen Cho-san, who came to the United States as a graduate student in physics in 1962 and became a member of the World United Formosans for Independence, Taidu Lianmeng, in the late 1970s, described this Taiwanese consciousness in his own words. It's an island always influenced by so many different outsiders, so gradually it formed its own identity. I think the poor fate of Taiwan makes Taiwanese even have to think more about helping Taiwan. Because Taiwan is always under somebody's mercy, right? Japanese, Chinese, they rule us, they don't treat us equally. They give you a small benefit, then we are so grateful. Actually, that should be ours to start, right? Another interviewee, Li Yuanze, who later became a Nobel Prize-winning chemist, characterized the climate during his high school years in Taiwan in the 1950s. He said, "This is the friction between the ruler and the oppressed rather than Taiwanese and mainland Chinese. But mainland Chinese came as the ruler and dominator." So I'm not going to read those other quotes, but you can kind of get a little bit more background about that there. Taiwanese who grew up during or immediately after the transfer of power from Japan to nationalist China observed these dynamics firsthand. For example, my mother, Lai Su-ching, grew up in a paper mill company town in northeastern Taiwan, in Yilan, in which Taiwanese workers were restricted to low-level jobs. The workers and their families lived in housing segregated first from the Japanese and then from the nationalists. Her father, who had begun working at the mill when he was 12, that's him on the right there, told her how the Japanese management had simply been replaced by KMT-affiliated Chinese management after the war. Although as a child she did not understand the details, her father taught her to cultivate a critical awareness of what was happening around her, particularly when it involved the government. As she described it, "I didn't know about politics, but my father was very outspoken at home. He was just very critical of the government. He always told me that when you read the newspaper, you should read it upside down. If they say white, it's black." Taiwanese identity and consciousness were therefore deeply shaped by anti-colonial and subaltern identifications. As much as it had been suppressed under martial law, this sort of consciousness was present in Taiwanese students' life experiences and family histories by the time they arrived in the United States. The conditions and connections they encountered upon arrival gave these already existing worldviews every opportunity to grow into action. So educational networks were not only the condition for their migration, but essential to Taiwanese students' ability to connect with one another in the US. A substantial proportion going to the US had been top students since elementary school and were consistently grouped with other top students. The college entrance exam admitted only the highest scoring students into the medical schools and science and engineering departments at desirable universities, such as National Taiwan University and Tsinghua University. As a result, roughly the same groups of students were tracked with one another from junior high school on. Since there were few postgraduate educational opportunities in Taiwan at the time, continuing onward to graduate school in the US became so common that large portions of whole graduating classes, say in the physics department at National Taiwan University, would find their way to the States, to the point that a common saying that probably everybody in this room knows, right, during that time went, 来台大去美国. The education system in Taiwan was tailored for this purpose. English was taught beginning in junior high, and students were encouraged to, quote, specialize in skills needed in the American job market, end quote. Consequently, the US was by far the most popular choice for study abroad, receiving 90% of Taiwanese student migrants in the 1960s and 1970s. These students, largely the top students of their generation, were considered to be the future leaders of society, although they were often advised by their families to avoid politics for their own safety. The first Taiwanese student associations in the United States were formed by graduate students and faculty at Midwestern universities in the early to mid-1960s. The concentration of Taiwanese students in the Midwest is striking. Most Taiwanese identified students came from working class backgrounds. This stands in contrast with mainlander students who are more likely to come from more class privileged backgrounds with connections to elite universities in California and on the East Coast. Taiwanese identified students therefore clustered in larger numbers in less competitive public research universities in which tuition was inexpensive and financial support was more readily available. Mm-hmm. 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 Yes, yeah. So I'll talk more about how they navigated that. Yes, but for sure, yes. So a typical arrival story once the flow of student migration was underway shows how quickly and naturally Taiwanese students became involved with the Taiwanese student associations. Arriving in Indiana to attend Purdue University in 1969, another Chris fan, not the one who's sitting there, Fan Xingliang, remembered the following. First day I remember when I arrived there, my classmate and her friend picked me up at the airport. They picked me up. I already had my dorm reserved. I checked in and they took me to a pizza place. It was the first time I had pizza. And then I asked him, were you close friends with that classmate? And he said, no, not really, because the Taiwanese friends come here, they all get together. So they had a group together, right? So it was very networked. During the 1960s, Manhattan, Kansas became home to one of the largest Taiwanese student populations and was the center for the budding Taiwan independence movement. Vivian Fu described the communal caretaking Taiwanese students engaged in there. It's a very tight organization. Like every time I need groceries, I call somebody and say, give me a ride. And early on when I'm in the dorm, one day a week, there was no dinner. I remember never being without invitation for a dinner somewhere on those days. And the ones that are married, they're like our host family. Any kind of holidays, you know, they're kind of like, I invite these 10 people, you invite those. They organize it like that, right? And this social structure repeated itself in every community. If there was a married couple, they kind of became a hub. And then it was very gendered too, right? Because then the women would have to cook for everybody. But that's something we talk more about in the discussion part. So she felt that this closeness was a strong factor in why she developed a distinct Taiwanese identity for the first time soon after arriving in Kansas. The social enfolded the political, right? And this is a really important dimension of how they organize themselves. At the University of Minnesota in the mid-1970s, sociology PhD student Patrick Wang Zaitian, lived in a rented house near campus with 6 other Taiwanese students. They rotated the cooking and exercised together daily, and it became a hub for the larger Taiwanese student community. They organized haircut days where you could come to the house to get a cheap haircut from a friend with some scissor skills, and learn to fix your car days. Huang's eventual induction into Taidu Lianmeng came about through a friend of a friend who loaned his car to help Huang move. A few years later, Huang would move to New York to become one of Taidu Lianmeng's few full-time activists, and later a key member of the Taiwan Revolutionary Party. So the structure of the social organizations enabled activists to use them as both broad networks and concentric circles of increasing politicization. Social activities involving the outermost circle enabled the spreading of ideas and recruitment into the inner circles. A second, smaller circle organized the events and discussed politics and tactics more openly. Finally, the third innermost core group, the smallest circle, were independence activists who organized the middle group. Regional softball tournaments were one activity that served multiple functions. Lin Wenzeng, who went to Syracuse University in 1973, felt that even the choice of the sport was subtly political in nature, and that it effectively attracted Taiwanese identified students who had been influenced by Japanese colonization prior to the arrival of the KMT. Later, Lin recognized that the core members consciously used the softball tournaments to recruit and fundraise. The annual tournaments connected Taiwanese from as many as 10 universities across the Midwest and between New York, Toronto, Detroit, and Washington, D.C. The informal, flexible social structure of the softball gatherings made them, in Lin's words, a very powerful tool. If people wanted to just play softball, eat, and enjoy the company of fellow Taiwanese, that was perfectly acceptable. Eventually, however, many repeat participants would become key members and leaders of the Tongxuehui or Tongshanhui. The informal social structure also enabled core members to filter out fellow students who might be spies. If someone behaved suspiciously, for example, suddenly asking questions about someone's personal background, quote, people would alert each other, watch out for this guy. If you are with so-and-so, don't say anything against the government, end quote. While mostly social, these types of regular gatherings created and strengthened activist networks for political events or activities, such as organizing transportation to protests and demonstrations in New York or Washington, D.C., or fundraising for political prisoners' families. The local and regional social gatherings created a sense of solidarity and nurtured the development of Taiwanese identity. They also strengthened relationships and trust necessary for risky interactions, such as sending money to contacts in Taiwan and person-to-person communication of sensitive news and information. So the third component of the development of anti-KMT Taiwanese consciousness was greater access to written materials combined with greater freedom of expression and the active atmosphere of political protest in the 1960s and 1970s around the world. Sometimes this was something student migrants had already anticipated and yearned for, to be able to read freely books that in Taiwan, quote, you had to risk your life to read, end quote, as one person described it. In addition to what they could read from libraries, students made self-published and circulated political magazines and journals via the Student and Community Association's contact lists. Some even went door to door to distribute them. Recipients might use chopsticks to turn the pages or to throw the material away, afraid of leaving fingerprints. In the late 1970s, Zhang Fusheng and Yang Yi, a married couple and members of the Taiwanese Association of America, New York, started a telephone line, Voice of Taiwan, Taiwan Zine, which eventually spawned 41 local affiliates and could be called from anywhere to access recorded messages describing the latest political developments concerning Taiwan. According to Morgan Zhang, I had gotten this idea from the fact that back then in the United States, we could call a phone number at any time to get the day's weather. I used this service every morning and thought it was very convenient. Voice of Taiwan became one of the most important and widespread means of communication among Taiwanese, both in and outside of Taiwan, sometimes serving. Okay. Mhm. Mhm. Right. And famously, they were the first to report out about the Kaohsiung incident on a phone call with you. Yes. Yes, right. So even people told me that even people in Taiwan were calling Voice of Taiwan to get news because it was not easy to get news when you were in Taiwan because of the level of censorship. So thank you, Linda. Taiwanese students, oh, let's see, Brian. Okay, so in Chicago in 1969, John and Alice Yu, who participated in starting the University of Chicago's Taiwan Tongshui Hui, and they have a story that echoes what Linda was describing, which is as soon as they filled out the form to establish the association, the faculty sponsor burned the form, right? So that their names wouldn't be in the record. So they established it and then they erased the evidence of it to try to minimize the harm that could be done to them. So John and Alice Yu at University of Chicago, they marveled at the constant student sit-ins, strikes, and protests against the Vietnam War and activism for racial justice and civil rights, a huge contrast after growing up in a country ruled by martial law. The willingness of protesters, including some of the most outstanding students, in their words, to speak up publicly against the government was eye-opening. Taiwanese students quickly gained the courage to participate in this active public sphere. For example, they often submitted op-eds to campus and local newspapers. In one institute at Kansas State University, Taiwanese and Chinese identified students debated publicly for weeks in the campus comment section of the student newspaper after the visit of a speaker who praised the achievements of the KMT in free China. A collegian reporter noted that this event, quote, caused more public reaction and comment than perhaps any speaker this year, end quote. The following month, a group of Taiwanese students took advantage of the collegian's paid advertisement space to memorialize the victims of the 228 incident. These types of local scuffles, although relatively minor in themselves, developed activist experience and prepared them for larger struggles in the late 1970s and early 1980s, when a number of significant events rocked Taiwan, including the release of the Presbyterian Church's Human Rights Declaration in 1977, the United States' severing of diplomatic ties with Taiwan and establishment of relations with the PRC in 1979, the Kaohsiung incident in 1979, the Lin Yishuang family murders in 1980, and the death of Chen Wenceng in 1981. In response to these events, supporters used many of the same methods developed in earlier campus and local struggles. For example, after the Presbyterian Church published the Human Rights Declaration, Zhang Fusheng arranged for his sister to smuggle the document out of Taiwan. In addition to continuously broadcasting the declaration on Voice of Taiwan, Zhang organized 68 members of Taiwanese American associations and churches to purchase a large ad in the New York Times calling for Taiwan independence. There you are, Linda. On the right. After the Kaohsiung incident, Taiwanese American communities wrote op-ed letters to the New York Times and the Boston Globe and sent money to prisoners' families in Taiwan. They set up tables on campuses and shopping malls to petition U.S. Congress members for support. The Formosan Association of Human Rights organized a national speaking tour for Linda Gale Arrigo, Ailinda, the American wife of dissident Chih-Ming, who had just been deported from Taiwan. At each of Arrigo's stops, they notified the news media and mobilized Taiwanese Americans across the country to show up. These efforts contributed to successful international pressure for an open trial for these dissidents. These examples show how by the late 1970s, local, regional, and national networks of Taiwanese Americans were well developed for trans-Pacific political activism, and core members had extensive experience organizing together by then. Even though they might move from one place to another, because of their similar educational qualifications and employment opportunities, they tended to cluster in the same places and could easily find one another. In this sense, their selective conditions of migration in order to develop U.S. geopolitical advantages in science and technology worked unintentionally to create the social conditions for collective activism. So many of the people I interviewed believed that they would not have become politically active in the same way or at all if they had not come to the United States. More than one person described themselves as an accidental activist. They believed that circumstances in the U.S. allowed them opportunities to identify as Taiwanese, which they would not have had if they had stayed in Taiwan. The oppressive actions of the KMT toward Taiwanese, even in the U.S., also put people who were blacklisted on something of a one-way road. After they lost hope of returning to Taiwan while martial law continued, they felt they had nothing to lose by doing more. From the experiences and perspectives of this generation, it becomes clear that through practices of surveillance, intimidation, and threat, the KMT inadvertently built the infrastructure for their own opposition, encouraging native Taiwanese to separate themselves from their Chinese-identified counterparts and awakening a Taiwanese consciousness in many who had never previously felt strongly about such things. Taiwanese in the U.S. were propelled by geopolitical forces and conditions beyond their control, excluded from most historical accounts, and marginalized in historical scholarship. In spite of, or perhaps because of these facts, they built resilient social networks and organizations that affirmed their own existence and yielded political networks that asserted their right to choose their own identities and futures. However, while the U.S. served as an incubator for the development of political activism oriented toward Taiwan, most Taiwanese migrants rarely questioned the role of the United States, in particular of its central role in supporting the KMT and sustaining the authoritarian regime. While Taiwan has successfully become a democratic society, questions of sovereignty and independence remain unresolved, particularly since China has risen as a global power and continues to claim Taiwan as its own. Last year, when I gave a talk to the North American Taiwanese Women's Association conference, President Hilda Lin Lai Hui-na said, quote, "There's never been any other generation like this. When we pass away, all this will be gone," right? She's talking about that first generation of Taiwanese who came mostly as students. So what legacy does this generation leave for future generations? As Taiwanese Americans, I believe that our legacy is a beautiful one of incredible courage, resistance, and community, but also a complicated and unfinished one of sorrow, state violence, and multiple colonialisms, including an ongoing semi-colonial relationship with the United States. As I hope my talk has shown, to be Taiwanese American is not a neutral descriptor of inherent characteristics, but formed out of specific historical circumstances. Internal historical conflicts and power dynamics continue to shape Taiwanese American communities in ways that are not always known or addressed even within our own communities, much less recognized or understood by broader publics. Without fully addressing these legacies and complexities, however, Taiwanese American individuals and communities risk continuing to be shaped by historical circumstances of which we only have partial understandings. The British Jamaican cultural theorist Stuart Hall famously described cultural identity as perpetually a process of becoming rather than a fixed essence. Identity is always in the process of being created in relationship to the past and what we understand to be the past. At the same time, trauma and migration can create dissonance as certain stories of identity and the past are chosen over others. Therefore, people who have migrated, and especially their descendants, can always be in search of what geographer Dina Georges describes as, quote, the better story, one that provides a better explanation for their current existence and orients us to work toward a better future. I hope that for my generation and future generations, as we continue to form our own Taiwanese American identities, we will continue to learn about our own history in relationship to Taiwan's ongoing history, always in search of a better story. So just want to show the last two slides to acknowledge that that this is a very pressing history to record and tell at this time, right? And these are 6 people I interviewed who passed away before the book was published, including my father. So I just wanted to dedicate this talk to them. And also for your reference, right? Here's the list of interviewees, archives, and very important people who helped me with translation. So thank you, and I look forward to Yolen's comments.
Thank you very much, Wendy. That's really informative, and it's really great to bring back some of the memories of the earlier generation. And I think you laid out, and thanks to Linda's intervention as well, a very clear, historical context for the emergence of Taiwanese American activism. So without further ado, I think, as you said, there's better story and there's more going on this island. So we'll have Wayne to kind of fill us in on that.
Thank you so much, Andy, for the invitation. And thank you, Wendy, for this excellent book. So I just want to tell a really small story because I first got to know Wendy's work through Asian Americans and race-related work at first. And by that time, I didn't know her as in person. And thanks to Andy, I think it was in a conference in American Studies that I got to know Wendy, not only as an Asian American scholar, but actually as a Taiwanese American. So really nice surprise on my part. And we also see how, I think her work from the early concentration on, race and racial relations in the US and now, extending to Taiwanese American history. But I think it also shows how there's a lack of curiosity and interest really on, Taiwan or Taiwanese American history overall in US academia. So I think the book really will serve as an excellent intervention, in the field. So I think my comments will really just try to expand Wendy's work to different fields of scholarship from both a Taiwan studies perspective, but also Asian American studies perspective. And I think there are 3 important aspects that this book, Island X, really serves, as a great intervention in the field. One is to add on the importance of understanding Taiwan through the US, China, Taiwan, or an internationalist stance. Second, it talks about how Asian American study really needs to incorporate diasporic perspective and geopolitical analyses. And 3, Taiwan can serve as a critical epistemological site in Asian American studies as well. So on the first part, the importance of understanding Taiwan through the US-China-Taiwan relations, really at the end of the martial law period, and we know recently there are more and more archives are open to the public. In Taiwan, there are many books that have been published and discussed in this particular Cold War period through these triangulated relation between the US, Taiwan, and China. For instance, Lin Xiaoting's Accidental State, right? Chiang Kai-shek, the United States, and the Making of Taiwan. He also uses US archive on the period to describe, the detectors' internal turmoil in making modern Taiwan in this contested geopolitical time. Or more recently, just published in Taiwan, Chen 老师的重探台湾政治史，美国国民党政府与台湾社会的三方角力。Also talk about Taiwan through this particular history and the important role of US in disciplining Taiwan and its relation with the KMT state. So all these books, I think, along with Wendy's Island Acts, show how the possibility of a modern democratic Taiwan is really not made magically, right, through one leader's hand, like the common Taiwanese myth about Jiang Jingguo as a father of democracy, or simply through the post-war US imperialist influences, as often articulated by the Anglophone or American studies. But it's really on a combination of different forces. And most importantly, the central role of this book is the Taiwanese student activists. So as a result of these triangulation of forces between the US, the KMT, the Dangwai movement in Taiwanese civil society, and the diaspora Taiwanese students movement, that we can see how, our understanding of the modern Taiwan and democracy is formed. And so Wendy really talks more about, right, the introduction in chapter 1 in this book, but I also want to highlight chapter 5, which is the case of the death of Chen. I think it's particularly illuminating because Wendy argues that far from being neutral or benevolent, the instance of Taiwanese students spied on by other Taiwanese on US campuses really illustrate the role of US educational institution as a critical site of the Cold War battles. So we often understood the death of Chen as a critical event that drove the US to take seriously the issues of authoritarian surveillance, since Cheng was also a US citizen. And the Taiwanese American community also took the chance to challenge the KMT surveillance on US campuses. This event not only pushes policy changes in the US, but also adds additional pressure on the already heated democratization demands from the Taiwan side. So as we can see, Wendy writes in Chen's case, along with many others in the book, also complicates the political biography of Taiwanese student activism in the US at the time. And currently, such overseas Taiwanese anti-KMT movement is often portrayed as singularly pro-independence and thought conservative and anti-communist. But the book really shows, I think, a much more complicated picture. For instance, as Wendy writes, while in Pittsburgh, Chen actually became particularly interested in the idea of the left pro-independence group that's called Taiwan Era, which took a Marxist-Leninist line and elaborated more profoundly and in a more explicit international stance, along with the earlier diasporic left publication headquarters in Toronto, that's called Taiwan Revolution. So these diasporic groups, as the book really illustrates, are not without their internal intellectual and ideological debates, I think currently as well, right? But it's really less talked about. And this also reflects the US activist political spectrum in the 1970s and 1980s, which I think was much more leaning towards this Marxist perspective. So this brings me to my second point, which is, why Asian American study needs to incorporate more diasporic perspective and geopolitical analysis. I think how Taiwan and Taiwanese American often erased from Asian American study or history, it's coming from several particular reasons. And Wendy also points out one of the reasons in the field that Asian American study really doesn't talk about Taiwan is because when it came out from the 1960 moment of international left politics, and up today, it continues to skew toward a more sort of specific working class and left politics that's more concerned with the US hegemony and the critiques of the racial politics domestically. And sometimes you can take on a more kind of Maoist stance from the Asian American left. So under what Wendy calls the infrastructure of surveillance, Taiwanese migrants were often framed as the good and the middle class immigrants were also ideologically seen as blinded pro-US. So the lack of differentiation between the nation state, the KMT party, the US influences, and the civil society in Taiwan, whether in Taiwan itself or in the diasporic spaces, often result in the fact that Taiwan is merely understood through the lens of the Republic of China, right, in this Cold War binary framework. It really misses the opportunity to see how this group of Taiwanese immigrants actually called the present nation state, that is the ROC, in question and organized creativity to achieve human rights and democratization, both from a liberal approach, but also in a more sort of left approach. So I think the centrality of race in Asian American study, is often eager to create a racial politics against assimilation. Yet this kind of eagerness neglects how racial politics can also be produced globally outside of the US, right? In fact, both Japan and the PRC have been the hegemonic forces in East Asia to create different ideology of racial superiority or racial victimhood to counter US influences. So by merely focusing on the US empire or the US only, I think the field really misses the opportunity to engage with the complexity of inter-Asia dynamics on how ethno-nationalist forces are forged and how the Taiwanese subject is in fact caught between the white assimilationism or the Zhonghua Minzu ethno-nationalism, Han settler colonialism, where some of the key players in the book attempt to re-articulate and create a new kind of national imagination. This was my question for Wendy. Maybe if you have time to elaborate more, whether they have different ideas about the imagination. And my third point is on how Taiwan can serve as a critical epistemological site in Asian American studies. And I think, as Chih-Ming actually states provocatively back in the 2018 North American Taiwan Studies Association conference, Andy and Lawrence Yang were both there, right? She provocatively says that Taiwan study is American studies. I think the book really shows how American study can also be a part of Taiwan studies. So placing Taiwanese American politics in relation to global politics, the multiple state regimes, colonial forces, and the Cold War conditions, we can see a fuller picture of how political changes occur in this period, both in the US, but also in Asia. It's never just the influence of Western abstract liberalism or human rights of democracy, nor one great leader who gave authority and rule, but the complex debates and struggle over difficult material conditions across the Trans-Pacific that allow the movements to happen. So as Wendy states, I think beautifully in the concluding chapter, while Taiwanese American often essentialized as the so-called good or model minorities, the state-centered logic obscured the historical condition and hierarchies of power that, she says, quote, deny Taiwanese American our full historical subjectivity and complex subjecthood. So I think just points for discussions. I'm curious about, because I asked Wendy whether she gave a lot of talks, already, but the book is just has just come out. But I'm really curious how folks have really perceived this work from Asian American study or American study perspective. And second, is there any way that we can put co activism in conversation with other, with I think the newer movements for pro-independence Taiwan activism recently? And at the end of the chapter, you quote many sort of second generation Taiwanese Americans in the incidents of in light of the death of the person who shot the Irvine Church incident. Right. So I'm just curious, like in your observation, do you see a different kind of politicization process for the second generation Taiwanese American? Because I think it's actually quite different how second generation Taiwanese American now come to the politics of Taiwan. And third one, just out of my curiosity, whether you think the Taiwanese American history can be in conversation with any other Asian national activism. So because in my own understanding, I know, like, for instance, in the Korean diaspora group, there's also ideological debates about nationalism, national imagination. So the question is really about whether Taiwan or Taiwanese Americanism is in itself an exceptional, phenomena, or is it really just a part of this Cold War history that's comparable to others? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wen, for this really beautiful remarks and really awesome questions. In many ways, I thought you're indeed the ideal candidate for this response. For this, as a role in this role as a respondent. particularly in the way that you brought out this these sort of inter-Asian comparative dimensions to it. I have a lot more to share, but I'll hold off as the moderator and perhaps invite Wendy to respond to Wen's comments first. In the meantime, friend on WebEx, if you have questions or comments, feel free to leave in the chat box if you like, or we can hold off your questions until Wendy's response to Wen's questions. Okay, so Wendy, please.
Thank you for those really thought-provoking comments and questions. A lot of the questions that you ask are questions that I still have. So I wrote them down, but so I think the first question was really interesting. Like, did Taiwanese student activists, or at least people who started becoming activists when they were Taiwanese students, did they have different ideas about their imagined nation? And I'd love to hear responses to this question from people who were activists from that time period as well, a little bit later. But for me, I was really interested in going back to the 60s and 70s, especially when to be anti-KMT was not to be anti-China, right? And so the second chapter is really about this global Sinophone political world that Taiwanese students encountered when they went to US campuses, right? So they were meeting students from Hong Kong, they were meeting Chinese Americans, and then students from Taiwan took different political positions, right? So in Andy's book, Trans-Pacific Articulations, and then Bo-Xi's work that's coming out soon, right? And he talks about, especially Bo-Xi talks about Taiwanese students who were really interested in Maoism, like so many other students and young people during that time period. But these histories are usually told separately, right? Or have not been told at all in English, right? How they were working out those politics among themselves, right? So the Bao'diao movement, when it started, was not necessarily taking a position supporting one nationalism or another, right, as Andy writes about really well, but those distinctions and separations happened along the way in the process, right? So if we go back to that campus informant form, the enemies of the KMT were communists and pro-independence groups, right? And what I was really interested in is sometimes those were not different groups, right? Sometimes those were the same group. And so part of my efforts to recover that history, as difficult as it was for me, especially as like a not being fluent in Chinese, right? So I do this work as an Asian Americanist, but hopefully to open the door for more scholarship to come, especially for people who are coming from Chinese language, who can really access in depth all of those amazing political publications that came out during that time period, but to open the door to that, right? Because I think that is the imagined nation that is not just about being exceptional or being an ethno-nationalist nation state, right? And so somebody like Chen Wenceng, what really interested me about his left, eventually pro-independence politics, is that he was in the beginning actually very an admirer of the CCP, right? So, and actually a footnote of Andy's led me to this, right? He dedicated his thesis to the working people of China, right? Yeah, and then he changed his mind like many people did, right? Because of developments in China, right? That disillusioned people from what they thought Marxism was and what it was in practice. And so, that's a much longer discussion, right? But what that meant to me is that he was interested in a future of justice that was not just for Taiwanese people, right? But was for working and oppressed people everywhere, right? And Taiwan Shidai, of which we have, a member here, they also were thinking about internationalist, revolutionary, Marxist-Leninist struggle and trying to put Taiwanese activism and the future of Taiwan into conversation with those other internationalist circles, right? But because of some of the dynamics that I write about in my book, at least the Taiwanese American communities tended to get farther and farther away from that, right? So my book is trying to go back to that moment, right, to recover that sense of possibility. So that was one of your questions. The second question, let's see, from Asian American. So I can't recall what the question was about Asian American or American studies. Oh, how it's received. So that I don't know yet. I'll be very interested to see, you know, but what's been, but I have presented on a lot of different parts of this research. And one of the good things about being a more like a mid-career scholar is that I had a lot of conversations along the way to writing this book, right? With Andy, with Yolan, with Chris Van, with Boshi, with so many people in this room, right? That helped me to think about this book as a conversation piece, right? And so that idea of like opening the door for different conversations to be possible. And so what has been really gratifying for me is scholars like Calvin Chung Miao, who wrote this great article called Boundaries of Democracy. That's a comparative examination of the Marcos regime doing extraterritorial murders in the United States and the murders of Henry Liu and Chen Wensung, right? It's an article called Boundaries of Democracy. Yeah, if you email me, I can send it to you, Linda. Calvin Chung Miao, CHEUNG-MIAW, right? But he wrote to me because he had read my New Bloom article about Chen Wensung, and he said, oh, I didn't know that Chen Wensung's politics were like that and about this like larger history that you write about. And that was very inspiring to me, right? So just the fact that we now know each other and can talk to each other and can try to figure things out together, that has been the best part of sharing this work. And I hope that part continues, right? Just like building those intellectual and political relationships, right? To like figure it out, because I think I often had the feeling when I was writing this book that, okay, I have some of the puzzle pieces, right? But I definitely don't have all of them, and probably I only have like this part of the puzzle, right? And so that's why I was constantly reaching out to other people to talk about it and to try to learn from other people's work. So to that point, Calvin Chung Miao's work, I think, is a great example of this question about the exceptionalism of the Taiwanese American case. So I think there are things that make Taiwan distinctive, right? But it is really helpful to have conversations with, at the American Studies Association conference just now, we had a panel about anti-martial law activism in the US between the Philippines, Korea, Mexico, and Taiwan. You know, so I think those conversations are really helpful to think about Cold War formations, right? And what kinds of politics become possible and what kind don't. I happen to be friends and colleagues with a lot of diaspora Koreans and Korean Americans, you know, so we talk about that a lot. You know, I always say like Koreans are our post-colonial siblings, right? But the politics in Korea, at least, have come out so differently, right? There's a much stronger kind of like working class radical politics, I think. But then there are also comparisons that can be made, right, about the thing that you can't say, right, about having to be anti-communist, for example. So I think those conversations are really productive and might get us out of the trap of ethno-nationalism as the end goal, you know, and as a way of kind of like, and so what I was hoping to do was create more of a sense of a history for that, right, rather than like having to create something completely new. So those are some answers to those really excellent questions.
Wow, really great. I really appreciate how Wendy really sets this up as an extension and conversation in many ways, right, across discipline. And I think that's what Wen was really pushing the envelope at, both in terms of the actual perception and responses people may have. I mean, I think every one of us in the room are very curious about how this might turn out, particularly with the possibility of it turning into a Chinese version and how this one, and when they come out, how people may perceive this, and the kind of history they were telling, which is within the mainstream, but also against the mainstream in some form. The other thing, which is also very interesting, is that this comparative and Cold War structure, in terms of, you know, the Cold War being the very important dominant geopolitical formation that Taiwanese Americans and Taiwanese, as well as other Asian, populations are involved. It is a common structure, but felt differently, or being articulated and expressed differently. And so in this sense, and with the fact that, Cold War is not quite over yet, I think this is going to play out a bit more now that we have a different formulation of that, with the PRC as a rising power and so on and so forth. So this is also where the point of your work really kind of brings into almost sort of bridging kind of work to bring Taiwanese studies or Taiwan studies in conversation with American studies, right? As a way to kind of, bridge these other conversations with the Philippines, for instance, or Korea in revert as well. So I know there's a lot of people on, quite a few friends online, and also a lot of comments in the room to be aired. So I'll stop right here. Maybe let me allow me to read this first question by Catherine Chai first, and then we'll open up to the floor to hear your responses and comments. So this is Catherine's question. Thank you, Wendy, for such a great talk. 2 questions. I was struck by the use of baseball as a community building practice. This really tells your age, Catherine. Did the Taiwanese students at the time also critique the Japanese Empire and its role in supporting the authoritarian regime in Cold War Taiwan? Second, how did these Taiwanese activists view indigenous Taiwanese in their visions of nationalism and democratization? In other words, because the demographic makeup of those who had the opportunity to migrate overseas was the Taiwanese American movement necessarily Han-centric. Okay, so we'll have this first and then we'll...
Thank you, Catherine, for those questions. So yes, the question about baseball. So I think Taiwanese students, like many Taiwanese in Taiwan at that time, were in this moment of valorizing the Japanese colonial period relative to the national period, right? So attachment to the Japanese colonial period became a way of supporting the formation of a distinctive Taiwanese identity that was not Chinese, right? So even though some of their parents, right, their parents' generation had been to be anti-colonial, for their parents' generation was to be anti-Japanese empire, right? For them, that was not the case, right? The identifications with Japanese definitely became part of that claiming of a distinctive Taiwanese identity. And I personally, so the one place in my book where that critique does emerge is in the case of Chen Yuxi. So Chen Yuxi was a student at University of Hawaii's East-West Center who was targeted, who got on the KMT's radar because he became friends with a lot of well-known communist and left activists, namely Eichel and John Reinecke in Hawaii, and because he attended some anti-Vietnam War protests. And then they also charged that he wrote for a pro-PRC publication in Japan, right? So he was arrested and imprisoned. And that was really interesting because the left in Hawaii was very radical and internationalist, right? And they had very active networks between Japan and Hawaii. So there was a Japanese journalist, Yasuyo Kawata, who was one of Chen Yushi's primary supporters. And so she brought in Japanese activists because Chen had been extradited from Japan to Taiwan, right, in the process of becoming arrested and imprisoned in Taiwan. And so in Chen Yushi's case, there was a radical Japanese politics that critiqued Japan as an empire that had oppressed Taiwanese and Korean people and committed atrocities in China, right? So that's the one place where that critique does show up because of that the particular global politics that came out of Hawaii to support Chen Yuxi. And then the second question, I think this question is definitely something that I have thought about a lot, about the how much activists during this time, pro-independence activists during this time, thought about indigenous Taiwanese, and I think very few indigenous Taiwanese were part of that student migration to the United States, right? And then from what I understand, indigenous Taiwanese activism for sovereignty and so on didn't really take off until after the martial law period, right? So there was not that awareness among people who were going to the US at the time of, and the same kind of critical self-reflection about Han settler colonialism that is much more common among younger generations today. You know, so I think this is a question I would like to hear more about from the audience, actually, you know, about that particular aspect of it. There was the one thing I wanted to say, though, one of one's questions that I didn't answer, which was about younger generations of Taiwanese Americans. And so I teach a class at the Claremont Colleges called Cold War Taiwanese America. And it's really one of my favorite classes to teach because I get students from all 5 of the Claremont Colleges. And most, but not all, but most of them have some Taiwanese background. And they're definitely of their generation, right? Very idealistic, very progressive, asking the hard questions, you know, and I do think there's a class differentiation between younger generations now and my generation, right? Because the first generation of Taiwanese migrants were pretty homogenous, right? Because the majority of them came as student migrants in certain fields, right? And so they were, although many of them came from working class backgrounds, they were upwardly mobile, right? So their class position and their ideological orientations a lot of the time would shift in the United States, right? But what I've noticed about my generation, my students' generations, is that their class backgrounds are more heterogeneous, right? And the kinds of historical experiences they've had are also more heterogeneous, right? Many of them come from mixed families, right? With mainlander and, you know, and Taiwanese, well, now a lot of mainlanders identify as Taiwanese, right? So that Waishenren and Benshenren, or mixed generational families, right? They have like, oh, you know, their parents are Taiwanese American. What? You know, that had not happened before. Some of them are 3rd generation Taiwanese Americans, or they have mixed race families, right? And so they automatically have to position themselves within a more complicated history and less homogenous history than me as a 2nd generation Taiwanese, you know, in relationship to that 1st generation. So I just wanted to make sure to answer that part. And because they were born after the martial law period, right? They have greater access to information. They have a much more intimate relationship with Taiwan than my generation was able to have because of martial law and changes in technology, right? You know, so they are able to tap into kind of like global Taiwanese, you know, trans-Pacific media spheres in ways that my generation was not able to.
We have another one on WebEx, but let's hold off on that, Din Liang. We'll actually open the room, open the discussion to the room to hear some feedback, because the Din Liang's question is more about the field. So maybe we'll come back to that discussion of the field later. But just in general, any comments, thoughts, provocations that you would like to, or, you know, questions you would like to have Wendy respond to, of course, Linda, and later Richard. Yes. Can you open the mic though, by the way? Yeah, thank you.
Okay. So basically, I agree with everything Wendy says. She has more of a, yes, but she's also given me some very valuable pieces of information, bits of information that I didn't have before. So Wendy, of course, has a much more subtle Asian American perspective than I do, because I pretty much take this all for granted. You know, looking from Taiwan is how strongly the Taiwanese Americans supported the democratic movement in Taiwan. And that was really a very important aspect of how the democratic movement could develop, especially under Jimmy Carter's human rights policy, because all these people were in contact with their senators and their congressmen and were continually organizing to elevate the issue of the oppression of the Cheng regime. And so I want to point out that as far as I can understand, the Taiwanese American networking and organization was very important in this. And I think you've shown the social environment in which this developed. And so I think this is different from the Koreans or from the Chinese now. So I was overall looking back, and even then I was very much impressed with the connections among all these different cities and campuses, mostly due to World United Formosans for Independence, we call WUFI, Taidu Lianmeng, which when you were talking, you didn't sometimes translate Taidu Lianmeng. That's World United Formosans for Independence, which we call WUFI. Now, WUFI is a very conservative organization, and I was part of the 1980s attack on WUFI for not recognizing that the US was behind the Chiang Kai-shek dictatorship. And Taiwan Era was really the important spearhead of that in 1980, attacking the very Taiwanese American and middle upper class basis of the Taiwan independence movement overseas. But they did try to shift the discussion, discussing Taiwan nationalism in the context of national liberation movements, which are international perspective, was one way they tried to shift the argument. But I can't say they were successful. They were actually not successful. But even now, okay, as we see but there was a sizable challenge to that conservative Taiwanese American mentality. And even now, as we see, I think since the late 1980s, the whole Taiwanese movement, Taiwan independence movement, has progressively moved to the right, together as the major threat has become the PRC rather than the Kuomintang. So after the Kuomintang was more or less defeated, it took up a pro-PRC position, and as we see now in the present presidential race, and then the Taiwanese American and the Taiwanese position has shifted over more to even more Cold War than it was in the 70s, right? When in the 70s, it was still influenced by the people who were anti-Vietnam War to some degree. Okay, now I think one thing that your presentation didn't quite present sharply was the 1971 split between the Du Pai and the Tong Pai, the Taiwan independents and the pro-PRC people. Now, this didn't happen just once. Okay, so 1971 was the Jiaoyutai movement, which became a movement in support of the PRC, against Chiang Kai-shek, but in support of the PRC and against the US effort to isolate China for such a huge period of time, which I definitely do approve of. But this, the rise of the Taiwan independence movement separately came out of this, whereas the pro-PRC people, a lot of people went to China, like the author Chen Roshi, and then it kind of fizzled out from there because of what they saw in China, like the Cultural Revolution. And of course, Chen Roshi is the major cultural figure who wrote about that. And in Taiwan, we had the parallel development with the democratic movement. Now, for Taiwan Shidai, Taiwan Era, I understand they split originally before 1975. They did not have a definite position on nationalism, which maybe you can talk about more. You have talked more at recent conference. But it also split between people who still thought that China might support real progressive forces in Taiwan and those who said, no, we have to really state we want Taiwan independent from China. So Taiwan Shidai came out of the left, which was originally undifferentiated and then differentiated. In Taiwan, in the Meili Dao period, obviously the pro-independence people or the nativist group was obviously the majority, but it really tried to keep the intellectuals, the leftist intellectuals, in a union. But that broke down I was there, I know, it broke down in April 1979 because the pro-Taiwan independence people made a statement supporting Taiwan entering the United Nations. And I typed it, I translated it, and April 12th. And when they issued that statement, the pro-PRC people basically dropped out or took a different position. So we also had the split between the pro-Taiwan independence and the pro-unification through in about that time, 79. And then the way the government suppressed the movement also differentiated, which I can't talk about in detail now. Okay, so then now looking back, as I think Wendy has been influenced by this, by me in this, if we look back now, it seems, okay, Taiwan independence, the Taiwanese Americans overseas have always been in support of independence. There was always these people. But Chen Wencheng is a pivotal case. And you have given me a very important clue from his thesis that he really was on the left. And I've repeated this time and time again because I was at his house in May. He was killed in July. And there was a group of students meeting in his house. I thought he was Taiwan Shidai's representative. And they were singing International, you know, 30 young people in his basement singing the International. And it seemed to me quite clearly this was a leftist movement that he was participating in. But the Chen Wencheng Foundation wants to say, no, he was never really a member of Taiwan Shidai. He's really not a leftist. And now I believe I can continue to insist on my position that he was a member of Taiwan Shidai. Okay, so I think probably Wendy has been somewhat influenced in her research by me in trying to remember and research and take this element that has now been forgotten among the Taiwan current politicians and current organizations. So that's a little bit long, but I guess I can end here and hope that our two members who are the actual Taiwan Shidai people, Jason Liu and Gao Chen, that they are going to have some comments at some point.
Thank you very much, Linda. 高医师 or well, it's actually a wonderful moment to hear, you know, because we have like more than, well, roughly 3 generations in a room. So, you know, in a way of kind of, you know, passing on the memory and also figuring out what happened in history, this is really a wonderful occasion to hear from our veterans. If you have something to share or say, of course, no pressure, but we'll certainly welcome that. Okay, Richard, yes, you have a question, certainly.
Yeah, thank you, Andy, and thank you, Wendy, for this beautiful book. And that gives me also an opportunity to meet such very important attendees or presence of people from, you know, the Taiwan independence movement, because I have, you know, had always the desire to understand more what is going on, mostly coming from an outsider's perspective. I came here as a researcher, and since I have been acquainted with, you know, Taiwan independence issues, there is always something that is intriguing me. So I think this is the main moment where I will also ask, not only from you, but also from, you know, everybody in this room to kind of help me understand. Although my question is simple. I understand the position of Taiwan independence movement and its contribution domestically in advancing human rights and fighting against the abuses of KMT or CPC. I understand it, or even any other positions. But my main question is when I take it in the global perspective, in the world system perspective, I just see basically 2 trends, which is, and I call it a linear progression of international politics, which is from the 1500s, the Dutch India company came for making profit and also colonizing this area. And when I try to follow, the aim was not interrupted until today. If you continue with Lord Macartney, and then you continue with Matthew Perry, the Commodore, or, famous writers like Jack London, or the Dulles family from the grandfather Watson and the children, Allen, as well as Foster, or Douglas. The aim was upon making Taiwan a colony, an outpost of the US empire, or call it what you want. So this is far before KMT or even, the daily politics of today, DPP or TPP. But I just don't get it when all this is not addressed by most of the scholars. The major ones would go to the Japanese era, but don't consider the de-imperialization process that is supposed to start even before that this part of the world came in contact with the West. So this is my major concern. If you could help me to understand if I'm the one getting it wrong, because in Africa currently, for instance, there is an alliance of Sahel states that is being formed after they realize that, the most painful scar that has been done to Africa is not slave trade, it's not colonialism, but the carving out of Africa in small little entities called nation states. And they have decided to bypass these borders and say, whoever attacked us, we will resist. And this was a direct message to France and also to the US. So this is a little bit my concern. Am I the one not getting it at all? Or there is something wrong with, what we call independence movement?
Thank you, Richard. This is really rich question in many ways. And I think you both put the question in a very short form, but also in historical perspective in terms of, anti-imperialism and decolonization questions. I'm sure Wang and Wendy will respond to that in a minute. But just before we have both speakers respond to the question, just one more time, maybe we can pick up another one or two from the audience. Boshu has one. Is there another hand? If not, okay, we'll have Boshu with the.
Hello. Yeah, thank you very much for this fascinating talk, and congratulations on the publication of this book. It's been a pleasure to see it evolving from a work in progress into its current beautifully complete form. So I have a brief question about a softer form of surveillance, because when we talk about this period, we've mostly been familiar with the tragic cases such as the Chen case, the Liu Yiliang case, but we know less about the other forms of surveillance. And I'm saying this because I once talked to Liu Daren, who was a student writer, activist, who belonged to one of those people attracted by Maoism you mentioned. And I asked him about how the KMT's overseas surveillance worked. And the first thing he told me about was actually the charter flight, so Baoji, because so the overseas KMT organ would arrange charter flights that flew between California and Taiwan. So, on holidays, Christmas break, Chinese Lunar New Year, overseas Taiwanese students wanted to return to Taiwan. But if it is found that you belong to one of these radical student activist groups, then you are not eligible to purchase, cheaper flight tickets. And if you do not belong to any of those radical student groups, then you can purchase cheaper flight ticket, and it worked. So I'm saying this because obviously, in addition to all those harassment, arrest, imprisonment, or even assassination, there were, there were certainly those aspects, the more brutal forms of infrastructure and surveillance. But there are, on the other hand, the KMT couldn't just rely on those hard tactics, right? They also had to rely on some softer forms of surveillance. So I'm just curious whether you have ever encountered any of those, more creative form of surveillance. Thank you.
That's such a great question, and I would love to hear more about that. I think some of our elders might have direct responses to that, but I think the missing piece for me is I was never able to talk to someone who was an informant, right? Because most people who are informants don't want to talk about that unless you're my angel, right? But so I think you heard that from somebody who was an informant, right? Is that correct or no? Activist? Okay, yeah, yeah. So I think one thing is that they were all like in the same communities, so there were very intimate and sometimes like very strange kinds of relationships that developed between people, so like Hong Zeseng, when he was who became the leader of the Taiwan Revolutionary Party, he was talking about the censorship in Taiwan, right, of letters. And, somebody had written a love letter, was like lamenting that the person that they loved didn't love them. And then the censor was moved by this and wrote marginalia, you can do it, take heart, like those kinds of interactions happen. So I think that's a little bit different from what you're talking about. So to me, that's a project that would be waiting to happen, that we won't really know those details because we only know what the activists experienced, right? And what they could glean from being the victims of that kind of surveillance. But yes, it was very mundane, and I always enjoy Linda's stories of reconstructing her daily route through National Archives records, because people were following her, right? And so on. And I found things like in the National Archives, like verbatim transcripts of telephone conversations that happened between, for example, the Zhang Fusheng and Yang Yi, the couple who ran Voice of Taiwan, right? So they're like verbatim transcripts of their telephone conversations between Taiwan and the US during that time period that are there in the National Archives. So a lot of it was very mundane, but I think that, yeah, again, I'm not really answering your question, but I'm interested in it. Yeah, but it was definitely very systematic, right? That there was a system there that we know some things about, but not those kind to that level of detail. I don't know if others want to jump in on that.
I would like to share my thought about what is the Taiwan independent movement. Well, first, I'm telling you my background. Your talk is very interesting because it's out of my memory. I'm back. Yeah. So I know Wendy's father. We are about the same age. And I was involved with this Taiwanese student movement in the US. But in 1986 to 1990, it's so evident, Taiwan is changing. Something is going to happen. It was, starting from 1990, 1992, this is a democratization of Taiwan. It's so strong. So me and Mr. Professor Gao, we decide we have to come back to participate in this process. In the US, it's just like the fish, the water, cannot do anything. So I'm telling you, just like the Republic of China, we keep to say Republic of China, but actually the Republic of China before 1992 and after 1992, I think is a completely two different entity. Yeah, completely different. And we keep saying that Taiwan is an independent movement. I think they keep changing. For example, in 1950, 1960, what is Taiwanese movement trying to be independent from? Is from the KMT style Chinese ideology. When I was in the grammar school, we are told, that Taiwan is, the biggest country. Republic of China is the biggest country in the world. It's even larger than the PRC now because we include the Mongolia. But that's really, when we go to study in the United States, within 6 months, I read the book about this Taiwan betrayed and the test of freedom by Chih-Ming. Within 6 months, like many of my friends, we completely become anti-KMT, because we realized what we were told in Taiwan is completely, lie. But during 1970, 80, after 1980, because of the relationship between China and US, so a lot of overseas Taiwanese, was threatened by this possibility of China were taking over Taiwan. That became a real threat. It doesn't exist before in 1960 or 70. So I think that the Taiwan independent movement that become a very big concern about the security of Taiwan. But still, because at that time, the 两岸关系 that the close spread, is still, there's no, we cannot go, either way. So it only happened when in the the opening of this, and that become, you can see, a lot of Chinese influence in Taiwan. So I think right now, especially after 2000, when I come back to Taiwan, I involved in the labor movement. Then I participate in the DPP politics, and I work with the Council of Labor. Council of Labor Affairs. Yeah, right. And what we have done is reform of the labor law, and I think between 2000 and 2006 or 2007, and Taiwan become a welfare state, a small scale but very universal. And right now I'm working, well, I'm retired, but I work as an advisor to the National Human Rights 人权委员会 National Human Rights Committee. So, as far as I can see, the so-called Taiwanese movement now is a completely different of the Taiwanese movement before. And especially a lot of people, they are still in the United States, they probably have a very little link with the domestic situation. They probably don't understand, what we should be fighting for and what we are fighting for. I think the Taiwanese independent movement now is a more comprehensive one. It's not only a political independence, but economical independence, cultural independence. So that's a very difficult task. But I think that's what, in my mind, is the goal of the Taiwanese independent movement now.
I don't know if, well, I think that answers partially Richard's question, but I wonder if Wang and Wendy want to maybe engage with that a little bit in terms of how to think about Taiwan independence movement as part of the decolonization practice.
Yeah, thank you for that earlier question. So I think what you are asking is part of what Chih-Ming was trying to do in his 400 years of Taiwan history, right? But I think also it relates to Catherine's earlier question about the relationship to indigenous Taiwanese, right? Because the place of Han settlers in that history is not so clear, right? So then the experiences and perspectives and political desires of indigenous Taiwanese people would also be part of that long-term analysis, I think, you know, of imperial and colonial relationships to Taiwan and how to think about them. But I don't know if this is answering your question at all.
It's easier.
Mhm.
Where does the Taiwanese American movement stand with regards to Pan-Asianism, if there is one?
The question about Taiwanese Americans. Yeah, I don't think there's a lot of awareness of those larger global and political histories. You know, so thinking about the conditions through which people migrated, you know, they were largely going to graduate school in the sciences and engineering, right? So a lot of people who had, and so the ones that tended to be more radical and left, a lot of them were sociologists, right? And I think others, like they read what they could, right? But also because of language, they were not always able to access broader world to make coalition and solidarity with other groups in the United States, right? So they're kind of limited to what was happening in the Chinese-speaking political worlds in diaspora. And then I think a lot of them were, because that the Taiwanese martial law period was so long, that goal of simply overthrowing the KMT took so long, right? They became kind of the sole, like the most important focus, right? And then by then people were raising families. They were, you know, kind of ensconced in US society. And, you know, I mean, these are my thoughts about why that analysis didn't happen, and also the class position, right? So a lot of people on the left, as our elders were saying, you know, felt that they had to return to Taiwan, right? Because in the US, the class position of Taiwanese is very limited, right? You're not going to be connecting with larger segments of Taiwanese society, right? And to develop those analyses. So that's my sense of that for the Taiwanese American community, their politics were kind of limited by the ways they were formed from the specific historical circumstances that created that generation. You know, but I don't know if, you know, anybody else wants to weigh in there.
Wendy, I wonder if there's any other questions in the room? Because I do have one. It's one to partly to respond to, you know, Richard's question, but also partly to kind of set up this conversation between Wang and Wendy a little bit more, and sort of tie that in with Dean Liao's question about the field discourse. This is actually the question about chapter 2, which Wendy calls genealogy of Taiwanese left, right? And I think part of the questions that have been circulating in the room is actually about how do we think about the left, both as kind of U.S., you know, political cultural formation that during the Cold War era has somehow obliquely excluded Taiwan. I mean, for political and, you know, and ideological reasons, and how the younger generation of Taiwanese American and also Taiwanese independence movement activists today are trying to recuperate and rearticulate, you know, lefty politics into Taiwanese national imagination as well as Taiwanese American thinking, right? Particularly tying in with the kind of discussion about the field. What, for example, as when asked earlier, what is Taiwan's value or intervention in American studies, right? Or reversely, how should Taiwanese and Taiwanese American, I'm sorry, this is so confusing. Taiwanese and Taiwan studies factor in the presence of, say, U.S. empire, right? So this is, in a way, getting back to Richard's question. And so in many ways, all this circle back to the idea, to the question of the left, right? And the story you're telling us is actually that, you know, out of this similarly rightist movement called Taiwanese independent studies, there was a leftist origin somewhere along the road, right? So on the one hand, the question is how do we reckon with that? On the other hand, the question is how do we make sense of it in these larger and intersecting formations, academically, politically, and geographically, even. So I wonder if we could sort of think this together, both, you know, Wen and Wendy. And that's way. So let me just kind of read, I think Liang's question to kind of, I already kind of tried to summarize into my comment just now, but let me just still read it in case I missed anything. So thank you very much for the talk. I would love to hear more about why Taiwan has been excluded from Asian American studies. I would say it's not excluded, it just has not been taken up as much. The speakers seem to be suggesting that Taiwan's alliance with the US marked a sharp contrast to Asian American movements that leaned more toward the left during the Cold War. And again, it was more sort of up in the air rather than leaning already. I wonder why during the Cold War, when Japan and the Philippines also shared an alliance with the US, their voices didn't seem to be neglected by the Asian American studies. In addition to Cold War ideological bifurcation, there are other historical trajectories that could help us make sense of Taiwan's situation in Asian American studies. Okay, so that really is the way to kind of bring, you know, that Taiwan into the center. So, yeah, Wen.
I mean, this doesn't exactly, so when I was in graduate school, which is actually when I first really encountered Asian American studies. So I came to ethnic studies late. I took my Asian American studies seminar was with Viet Thanh Nguyen, you know, who is now known as the Pulitzer Prize winning novelist, you know, outspoken writer, but this was before he was super famous. And he wrote a book called Race and Resistance, which was a critique of the politics of the field of Asian American studies that was always looking for resistance, you know, and privileging resistance over other forms of being and political consciousness. And I think there are good reasons for that, you know, because many of us who go into Asian American studies and ethnic studies want a different kind of world, right? And are looking for finding legacies of social transformation. But what that means is that there are whole spectrums of political consciousness and ways of being in the world that are not studied in those fields, right? So that means that we give up Taiwan to be studied by political science, right? Or sociology, right? Which have strengths, but are not doing that kind of critical analysis of political consciousness formation. It also means there are a lot of people who come into, for example, US society to be positioned as middle class, right? Or develop conservative politics that are also not studied, right? And arguably, those are the majority of Asian American communities today, right? So for us to be relevant as a field, we have to think about not only how people on the left, but also people across the whole political spectrum are formed by political histories, right? And so what I always tell my students is like, our project is to rehistoricize race and identity, right? Rather than to think that being Asian American automatically means you're going to be oppositional, right? That's not actually the reality that most Asian Americans live in, right? Even though it's a reality that some of us desire, right? But if we only focus on that desire, that means that we're not actually being serious intellectuals, right? So to me, it was important to recover that complicated left history because I care about that and because I wanted to open up a broader spectrum, right? But the larger intellectual process is that rehistoricization of race and identity, right? Which gets us out of these kind of identitarian essentialisms, right? And actually gives people who are coming from very different places a place to start talking to one another about how we're being formed by the histories that we come into, you know, so that's one way of answering that question.
I'm thinking about Ding Liang's questions, and so from my understanding in Asian American studies, I think there is a long tradition of, or also actually with area studies, there's a long tradition of criticizing, right, the Japanese Empire. So it's always been visible, I think, in critical scholarship. And to the opposite, I think for the Philippines, there is, I think, really strong infrastructure of diaspora activism, right? So if you go to see a leftist protest, you usually see a Filipino group along with other sort of US-based leftist group. So they kind of serve as one is like the model empire in Asia, and another one is the model resistance forces. So really interesting examples there. And I think one of the reasons why Taiwan has been missing, I mean, from my, I guess, area of study, which is psychology, you know, it's usually because like during the Cold War, like the 70s and 80s, Taiwan was incorporated with this like cultural Chinese or cultural China idea. So there's not that much distinction between studying Taiwan and studying China. I think there's some similar tension, I think, in area studies as well. And when you look at cultural products, I think it's in the past 10 years or so, we have many Taiwanese American writers writing memoirs or writing fictions, or we see more Taiwanese American representations in the mainstream. And I think it's also due to you know, a shift in more second generation Taiwanese identified Taiwanese American, right? Because like before, I mean, there's only a minority of really radical migrants who identify themselves as Taiwanese. So I think it's there are many reasons. Like obviously one is theoretical, another political, but also just in terms of I think sociological migration history that you know, create this division. And I'm thinking about, you know, the comparisons of the Taiwanese left between, you know, what Wendy wrote in a book and currently, I think people are drawing different comparison of empires now. So for instance, in the groups I know, you know, like people feel this particular affiliation with Hong Kong, sometimes even Palestine, who face this kind of forces of multiple empires, right? And but within Taiwan, I mean, there is a weaker left in general, but the left in Taiwan would, I think, often privilege class politics over nation, which is very different from, I guess, Taiwanese pro-independence activists who privilege nation over class. So there is that division, I think, still exists. But really interesting, I think, just with the diasporic Taiwanese left, because many of these people were also educated in the US and through Asian American studies. So there is this, I think, more intersectional attention to both class and national politics. And it is really hard to reconcile them, but there is definitely debate and talk about how we think about both rather than only the nation over class.
All very self-provoking. And it's only showing that it's actually not so easy to talk about Taiwan, you see. I mean, it's a, yes.
Just answering this because I think it addresses speakers and I wanted to say that the main problem is not about the voices because the person talked about the voices of Japan and the Philippines that were not neglected. It's not about speaking or writing in American studies. I think the main problem is about sovereignty. And we have authors like Chen in his book, you know, about de-imperialization. He shows that, you know, Japan is under American military occupation. So the main problem is not speaking or having Japanese identity, but how is the daily foreign policy and business run? So long as it is under military occupation by whoever it is, but in this case, it's the US, then he thinks that their voice doesn't count as such. And he takes the example also of Taiwan. He says Taiwan is at the level of a sub-colony. It's not even a colony. So I think this is the answer that I would like to give, to say that the problem is not the voice. We can even sing, shout, and do whatever. But what is the sovereignty, which entails also getting rid of military occupation?
Okay. Thank you, Richard. This is precisely why I said it's not easy to talk about Taiwan, especially when you want to talk about sovereignty. But in any case, there's a little follow-up by Catherine, so let me just quickly read this. You briefly mentioned that there was a gender aspect of the Taiwanese American movement, I think, when you talked about cooking, but also the three cases you cite. If I recall correctly, focus on 3 male individuals. Can you speak a little bit about that? Okay, so that's one question. Okay, so maybe we'll just have Wendy give a take on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine, for another great question. Yeah, and this is something that I didn't address in a lot of detail in my book. Most of the people who I was told to talk to who had leadership positions, right, and as activists did tend to be men, you know, and Taiwanese society and Taiwanese American society at that time was very patriarchal, right? So the women were often in the background of the movement, right? Cooking, taking care of the children, typing, you know, transcribing, something that Linda knows well. And so I did try to purposely seek out women interviewees, right, who had different relationships to that kind of division of labor, right? Some of them were fine with it, right? Some of them chafed against it, right? And so, for example, I tell the story of Elena Ling, who later became one of the founders of the North American Taiwanese Women's Association. And that association was founded precisely to create a space for Taiwanese women without having to be overshadowed by or having to serve their husbands, right? And also, it was a very very heteronormative in general, you know, generation, right? At least in terms of the people who I interviewed. And so Elena Ling's story was that she was the one who was more of an activist, but her husband was automatically the one who was tapped to join WUFI, right? Just because in people's eyes, like the men were the ones who were supposed to be the activists and the women were supposed to stay in the background, right? So since then, Taiwanese women have, and then for some women like my mom, who really chafed against it, right? That was one of the reasons she was very attracted to Marxism, right? Because Marxism, Chinese Marxism at least had the principle of, you know, women hold up half the sky, right? And so she was hanging out with the students from Hong Kong. And I know Uncle Gao remembers my parents' arguments about that, all of that, right? And so it was another way, right, that a certain kind of feminism could be expressed in these encounters in the college campuses, right? But for the most part, I don't, you know, there are individuals in that political history that would allow someone to go more deeply into that, right? But I was not able to really do that in my book. But yes, that kind of like heteronormative gendered division of who was supposed to be active in politics and who was not was definitely present.
Before we close, there's actually one more question from the floor, so maybe we'll have this lady to ask her question.
Okay, hi, my name is Gracing. I'm from National Taiwan, National Yangming Jiao Tong University, and I'm a PhD student right now. Thank you, Professor Chen, for this amazing talk. I'm not sure if I have a question, but I just want to share my experience because my dissertation is focused on overseas publications in 1970s and 1980s, and also research about the voice of Taiwan. And I have an amazing experience that I have opportunities to interview over 60 first generation Taiwanese American. And I just want to share that when and because of the Taiwanese Voice of Taiwan has 144 recording in Wusanlian Foundation. And when I listen to this recording, I felt really touching because they always speak out that the position of what is a role as a Taiwanese American back to 70s. And they always say that because back to that time, 党外运动 is really is really active. Yeah, so they just say that as a overseas Taiwanese, they have to speak for their own country. And they always say that as a Taiwanese American, they have to 领金探家的爱大大奉献。So yeah, so yes, and I just feel really touching. And when I interview them, and they still have that passion. So, okay, so my question is about as a Taiwanese American second generation, what do you think about what is the role of the second generation, and do you think that because some of their okay, that's my question. Yes. Thank you.
Yeah. So I don't know how to speak for all second generation Taiwanese Americans because I think I'm a pretty contrarian one. You know, I think that I can speak to what I thought my own role was, you know, as an Asian Americanist scholar, which is to tell the history and try to make space for, you know, and I'm also so glad to hear that you're doing this research, right? And that you have done these interviews, and really exciting also that you are using the Voice of Taiwan recordings, right? To kind of go back to that moment. So I think it's one thing I would say is that it's very important as a Taiwanese American not to overstep because another thing about the way that people perceive race and ethnicity in the US is that, oh, you're Taiwanese rather than Taiwanese American, right? And they automatically think that Taiwanese Americans can then represent Taiwan and Taiwanese culture and politics and so on, right? But a lot of us actually are in the process of learning more ourselves about that history, right? So I would say one duty of second generation Taiwanese Americans is not to speak for Taiwan, right? To be humble and aware of our identity as Taiwanese Americans and to learn from that, you know, to the extent that we want to or in the ways that make sense for each of us individually, right? But to be really cognizant that we are not Taiwanese, you know, so that's, you know, that's one answer to that question, you know, but I am doing political and historical education with my students who are, you know, first to third generation Taiwanese Americans, just because it was such a long process for me to find as many materials as possible in English to really understand, you know, Taiwanese and Taiwanese American history as well as I could, you know, so I'm trying to give that to them earlier on, you know, because one thing for most Taiwanese Americans is that we don't know where to go to learn more about our own history, right? So I would say that hopefully people would want to learn about that history, but also be really clear about our positionality, right? That it's not the same as being Taiwanese.
I hope that satisfies everybody. It's a 2-hour-long event, and I cannot thank Wendy and Wen enough for engaging with us such a lively conversation about very important topics. Particularly, I want to express my gratitude to these veterans who are in the room: Linda, Liu Yishi, Gao Xian, for being here, because they are the carriers of that memory, and there's a lot to learn from them. Personally, I worked with Lin Xiaoxin before and have actually seriously learned a lot. I mean, from him as both his own, his way of doing things, which I don't always find agreeable, but certainly a lot of the spirit of the period that has more or less been lost currently. So it's really important to kind of gather our memories of the past and think about the politics and how that evolves. As I think Luis was talking about earlier, it is a historical progression, right? So what happened there didn't just stay there, but it does progress with time. And it really is up to the later generation to kind of figure out what to do with it. So I think on that note, I want to thank Wendy for doing such an important work, doing such a fabulous book. And hopefully the Chinese version is going to be available before long. And with that, perhaps we can do another round of conversation, engage in a wider, participants. Just as I hear you talking about, I've been thinking about like Shuwei and various others who could be part of this conversation and make it more interesting than it already is. Last but not least, I just want to sort of gesture to the fact that just last weekend there was actually a gathering in protest for Palestine and particularly Gaza right in front of the AIT. And I was heard that there's going to be another one on 21st, I think. It's on Saturday, right? Right. And also in front of the Israeli. Oh, that was yesterday. Okay. So the the spirit of left is not over yet. Although this may not be the regular group of people that you find as you would find in the Taiwan independence movement. But that aside, I just want to say, this is actually an ongoing conversation and ongoing history. We not only have witness of the history, but also, the future of history. So with that, I want to thank again Wendy and Wen for being here, and all of you for being here for this event. Also the friends who are on WebEx. Thank you for bearing with us, and thank you for joining in. I hope we'll see you again before long. Thank you very much. Everybody's welcome to stay to chat with Wendy and have coffee. There's still plenty to let. Yeah, you can stay in the room till 5. That's fine, but we just have to officially close and let our staff to go to attend their other businesses. So thank you, Jiaqi and Jia-Ming for helping out. So thank you very much for being here.